The first thing he heard was not gunfire, it was engines. They rolled through the French dusk like a low tide that would not retreat, steady, layered, impatient. A German quartermaster officer stood in the doorway of a requisition farmhouse and listened as if sound could be measured like fuel. The front was somewhere west and north, shifting by the hour, but this noise came from the rear, where wars were supposed to slow down, where the map lines were supposed to breathe and reorganize. Instead, the road carried a constant hum, not a convoy, not a column, a flow. Inside the farmhouse, the air was warm with smoke and damp uniforms. Maps were pinned to walls, pencil marks crossed and recrossed the same rivers, the same rail spurs, the same shrinking zones of control. The quartermaster's name was unimportant. He would later be described in reports as an experienced logistical staff officer, and that was all. Men like him were not celebrated because their work did not explode. Their work was the absence of explosion, the quiet arithmetic that kept rifles loaded and tanks moving. That arithmetic had once favored Germany. In earlier campaigns, speed had been Germany's weapon, and the supply system had been built to feed speed. Rails carried the bulk, depots fed railheads, trucks pushed supplies the last distance to the fighting formations. It was controlled, centralized, efficient, and, under the right conditions, brilliant. But now those conditions were gone. The skies belonged to Allied aircraft. The marshalling yards were cratered. Bridges lay broken in rivers like snapped bones. Trains that once moved like clockwork now moved like hunted animals, hiding in forests, waiting for night, praying for cloud cover. And still the engines on the road did not stop. A liaison officer entered with mud on his boots and a kind of disbelief in his eyes that the quartermaster recognized as dangerous. Disbelief meant the mind was behind reality. The liaison spoke quietly at first, then faster, as if speed could make the story more plausible. They are running trucks through the night, he said, not only in daylight, in darkness, one after another. The quartermaster looked up from a stack of ration tables and casualty returns. Trucks always run, he said. They must, but not like rail. Not as an artery. The liaison shook his head. Not like trucks, Herr Hauptmann. Like a river. Headlights masked. Military police at every junction. One-way routes. If a vehicle breaks down, it's dragged into the ditch within minutes. The line closes around it and keeps moving. Someone at the table laughed, tired and sharp. American showmanship, he said. They love spectacle. The quartermaster did not laugh. He had spent years watching how armies truly moved. Showmanship did not keep artillery fed. Discipline did. The liaison's description carried discipline like a smell. Where? The quartermaster asked. The liaison pointed to the map, tracing a thick finger along a route that bent toward the front. Here and here. The same pattern. They mark the roads. They control the roads. They do not allow civilian traffic. They do not allow stoppages. It's organized. Organized. That single word hollowed out the room. If it was organized, it could be scaled. If it was scaled, it could change the war. Not by brilliant maneuvers, but by the one thing Germany could no longer guarantee, continuity. The quartermaster returned to his papers, but he did not see them. He saw a question instead. How did an enemy army, advancing faster than its ports and railways could support, refuse the natural pause that should follow victory? How did it keep moving when the mathematics of distance and tonnage demanded a break? German staff officers had always believed that logistics was the leash on operations. You could surge, yes, but you would eventually feel the collar tighten. Overextension would expose you. The enemy would counterattack. The war would punish impatience. And yet the engines outside sounded like impatience turned into policy. Over the next days, the reports multiplied. Reconnaissance notes described endless vehicle movement along designated routes. Prisoners mentioned traffic control points, refueling stations, repair teams that seemed to appear wherever a truck coughed. Captured documents referred to a system, an emergency measure perhaps, but one that had been planned with the kind of administrative thoroughness Germany reserved for mobilization orders. The quartermaster tried to quantify what he could not see. He asked for estimates: trucks per hour, tonnage per day, fuel consumed, tire attrition, road damage. Even conservative numbers made the pencil feel ridiculous. Thousands of vehicles, burning enormous quantities of fuel, carrying ammunition and rations and spare parts forward like a moving warehouse. His colleagues were skeptical. They had reason to be. Trucks broke down, drivers tired, roads clogged. A single bomb crater could halt an entire stream. Rail was superior. Rail was efficient. Germany's logistics doctrine had been built around the cold logic that you could not replace steel rails with rubber tires and expect to feed an army. But doctrine was a map. Reality was mud, smoke, and time. The quartermaster had studied the German system until it lived in his bones. Rail lines were the nation's nervous system. Supply depots were organs. Rolling stock was blood. Control was the obsession. In planning rooms, control looked like competence. In 1944 France, control looked like fragility, because the enemy had learned to fight control with destruction. Allied bombers, heavy and relentless, had turned marshalling yards into moonscapes. Fighter bombers hunted locomotives. Bridges were destroyed, repaired, destroyed again. Even when trains ran, they ran late and light. They hid in forests. They waited for darkness. They died on schedules that were no longer printed by German planners, but by Allied pilots. German logisticians still believed in efficiency because efficiency was what you believed in when you did not have enough. You rationed, you optimized, you controlled. Waste was sin. The Americans, the quartermaster realized, did not treat waste as sin. They treated waste as the cost of refusing to stop. He saw it in their methods and in their psychology. Germany's system demanded that every ton moved be justified by calculation. Because Germany could not afford generosity, the Allies could. And generosity, when applied to logistics, did not look like charity. It looked like redundancy. It looked like spare trucks, spare tires, spare fuel. It looked like the ability to take losses and keep moving. Efficiency versus resilience. That was the contrast that began to haunt him. In the summer of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy, the front raced eastward faster than even Allied planners had expected. German staff officers watched the advance with a strange mixture of dread and hope. Dread because the enemy was moving. Hope because speed was supposed to contain its own weakness. A fast-moving army outruns its supply. That is not ideology, it is physics. German commanders were trained to recognize the moment when a spearhead becomes a liability. In earlier years, German panzer leaders had exploited that moment against others. Now they waited for it like farmers waiting for frost, an inevitable limit that would slow the enemy and give Germany time to recover. The quartermaster listened to the chatter. Allied units are far ahead of their depots. Allied fuel is short. Allied artillery is burning ammunition at a rate railways cannot replace. Surely they must pause. Surely their victory will force them to breathe. Then the reports came in, and the pause did not arrive. Instead, Allied traffic increased. The quartermaster heard about routes controlled like arteries. Military police posted at junctions, stopping everything that did not serve the flow. Signs, simple, brutal, effective, directing vehicles along one-way loops, staging areas where trucks queued not to wait, but to be fed into the stream in controlled pulses. Recovery vehicles positioned to remove breakdowns before they became blockages. Repair teams assigned to the road itself, like surgeons assigned to an artery. The Germans had expected Allied operations to be bold and tactical. They had not expected them to be administrative. The quartermaster requested any captured briefings on the system and received fragments, references to an urgent supply scheme, to designated routes with priority traffic, to strict rules against unnecessary stops. Some documents use the same phrase again and again, as if repetition made it real. Continuous movement. He read prisoner statements too. An American driver, young and hollow-eyed, described it in plain language. "We just keep going," the boy said. "They tell us, don't stop unless you have to. If you stop, you're the reason the guys up front don't get their ammo." That sentence felt like a weapon, not because it was poetic, but because it revealed the enemy's moral architecture. The driver did not speak of glory. He spoke of responsibility scaled. At night, the quartermaster lay on a cot and listened to engines like distant rain. He imagined an American system that could turn responsibility into tonnage. He imagined a war where discipline did not only mean obeying orders at the front, but obeying traffic rules in the rear. It sounded absurd until he realized absurdity was exactly what Germany could no longer afford to dismiss. A week later, a reconnaissance report described a road painted with red markers and controlled by a network of checkpoints. Vehicles moved in a single direction, hour after hour. The report used a phrase that sounded like a civilian's description of a factory. Traffic flows. The quartermaster stared at the words. Traffic flows. That was not how German reports usually spoke. German reports spoke of units, objectives, and enemy concentrations. The language of logistics was always present, but always subordinate. Now the language of logistics was becoming the language of survival. He convened a small meeting with other staff officers. "If they have replaced rail with road," he said, "then our assumptions about overextension are wrong. They have found a way to stretch the leash without feeling the collar." One officer scoffed. "Rubber cannot replace steel," he said. "The roads will break. The vehicles will die. Their fuel consumption alone will—" "Fuel," the quartermaster interrupted. "Yes, fuel should limit them. That is the point. And yet they are moving, so either the fuel is there, or they are spending it with a ruthlessness we did not expect." Ruthlessness. Not against people, but against the concept of stopping. The quartermaster left the meeting with no comfort. He had convinced some and irritated others. But the question remained, how did the Allies keep their trucks breathing? The answer, he soon learned, was not a single trick. It was a stack of solutions, each one dull on its own, terrifying in combination. Fuel dumps pushed forward as quickly as the front advanced. Standardized containers and jerry cans allowed rapid distribution. Refueling points were placed along the routes with the efficiency of a postal system, and behind it all was an industrial capacity that treated gasoline not like a precious substance to be hoarded, but like a necessary fluid to be delivered. Germany's fuel situation was a constant wound. German panzer units were sometimes reduced to immobility, not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. The quartermaster had watched armored formations sit as if paralyzed while orders arrived demanding movement that could not be executed. He had watched commanders argue with fuel officers like men bargaining with fate. To hear that the enemy had made fuel distribution into an operational weapon was not merely alarming, it was humiliating. Germany had once treated operational tempo as its own signature. Now Germany was the army waiting for the enemy to pause, and the enemy refused to grant the pause. The quartermaster began to see the deeper pattern. The trucks were not the miracle. The trucks were the visible symptom of an invisible commitment. The Allies had decided that logistics itself would be an offensive. They did not treat supply as support. They treated it as a front of its own. In German doctrine, supply was behind. In Allied practice, supply was beside. He saw it in the way Allied units appeared, not like bursts of brilliance, but like the steady arrival of a tide. German intelligence would report Allied concentrations forming rapidly, artillery supported by ample ammunition, infantry with rations and winter gear, arriving with a predictability that felt unnatural in wartime. German units could still win moments, ambush a column, hold a village, counterattack at a weak point, but the moments did not accumulate into campaign success. They were isolated sparks against a machine that kept turning. A German infantry officer wrote in a field letter, later forwarded up the chain, that the enemy fights like a factory. The quartermaster underlined the phrase. It was not a compliment, it was a diagnosis. The Germans tried to fight the roads. They mined routes when they could, ambushed convoys, cratered bridges, and harassed traffic with whatever air power remained. The quartermaster helped propose interdiction plans. Strike the choke points, destroy the recovery vehicles, force jams. If you could cause a jam, you could create a pause. If you could create a pause, you could create opportunity. But the war had shifted. To destroy the enemy's logistics required the freedom to move and the freedom to fly, and Germany had lost both. Allied aircraft prowled in daylight, turning German movements into suicides. A German team moving to lay mines risked being observed and attacked before it could even finish its work. Bridges could be destroyed, yes, but the Allies repaired them with an energy that seemed less like engineering and more like ritual. Rail yards could be cratered, yes, but the Allies had already chosen not to rely on rail, at least not until major ports could be captured and restored. The roads were messy, but the roads were available. Even when the Germans succeeded, the results were not decisive. A convoy destroyed meant a convoy replaced, a bridge demolished meant another crossing built, or a ferry established. An attack that would have crippled a fragile supply system became a temporary inconvenience to a resilient one. The quartermaster began to understand that the enemy had planned for failure as a normal cost. Germany treated failure as catastrophe because Germany could not afford repetition. The Allies treated failure as friction because they had the mass to absorb it. He imagined the Allied supply road like a river and German interdiction like throwing stones into it. The stones made splashes. The river flowed on. The quartermaster's unease deepened when he learned that Allied road logistics were not only moving ammunition and rations, but also spare parts and maintenance capacity forward. That meant the system did not simply deliver supplies, it delivered the ability to repair itself. A broken truck could be recovered, serviced, returned to the stream. A tire could be replaced. An engine could be swapped. The supply line was not only a pipeline, it was a living network. German logistics had once been praised for improvisation under pressure. In 1944, improvisation was what you did when the plan failed. The Allies had turned improvisation into a plan. And then there were the ports. German officers had counted on the obvious truth that armies needed harbors. Normandy's beaches had been expected to starve an invasion. If you could deny major ports, you could strangle the enemy. The quartermaster understood this logic intimately. It was the same logic Germany applied when it attacked shipping lanes and harbors. A port was an artery of steel and salt water, but the Allies had brought their own harbors. At first, German staff dismissed the reports. Portable harbors sounded like fantasy, like something engineers dreamed in peacetime magazines. Yet evidence appeared, vast structures assembled off the beaches, creating sheltered waters where none existed, allowing ships to unload at scale. The quartermaster did not need to know every technical detail to grasp the implication. The enemy had reduced dependence on fixed geography. They had changed the map. The more he learned, the more he felt a strange inversion. German planners often relied on the enemy's limitations as part of their own strategy. But here, the enemy was erasing limitations faster than Germany could exploit them. He thought of the old German confidence, that Europe's roads and railways belonged to German planning, that German efficiency would always outclass the enemy's alleged chaos. Now the enemy's chaos had become a kind of order, an order that looked like speed's most mature form, continuity. The quartermaster wanted to understand the human engine behind the system, because systems did not run without bodies. So he read prisoner interrogations carefully. A driver described being told to keep moving, to sleep when he could, to eat in the cab, to accept that fatigue was part of the job. Another described a strict traffic discipline, enforced by military police who treated the road like a battlefield. A mechanic described recovery teams tasked with clearing breakdowns before they could halt the stream. A traffic controller described being posted at junctions for hours, directing flow, stopping any vehicle that did not belong, keeping civilian carts and local traffic away. None of it sounded glamorous. It sounded like factory work under threat of death. The quartermaster found himself unexpectedly respectful, and that respect felt like betrayal. He reminded himself that respect was not admiration. It was accurate perception. Underestimating the enemy was a luxury Germany could no longer afford. He thought of German soldiers at the front, living on reduced rations, watching fuel allocations shrink, watching ammunition become a rationed commodity. He thought of how German units were forced to conserve movement, how orders demanded maneuver that could not be supplied. Then he thought of American drivers being pushed to exhaustion to prevent the enemy from breathing. It was a different kind of brutality. A German staff officer joked once that America's greatest weapon was the truck. The quartermaster did not laugh. He realized the joke was true, and truth was not funny. As autumn approached, the German quartermaster watched the front's behavior like a man watching weather. When the Allies had supplies, they pressed. When they had supplies, they attacked not only with firepower, but with endurance. Their artillery could maintain high rates of fire. Their armored spearheads could exploit breakthroughs quickly. Their infantry could be rotated and resupplied. Their wounded could be evacuated. Their fuel could be delivered forward. When the Germans lacked supplies, they became intermittent. They should still fight fiercely. They could still win local engagements. But their fighting was punctuated by pauses forced on them by shortage, fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, repair delays, broken communications. They were strong in bursts, weak in continuity. The quartermaster wrote a summary that tried to explain this in the language of staff officers. Enemy operational tempo appears sustained by distributed road logistics under strict traffic control, he wrote. Efforts to induce pause through interdiction have limited effect due to enemy redundancy and rapid repair capability. Our own operational capacity increasingly constrained by fuel and transport limitations. He looked at the sentence and felt its dryness. Dryness was the natural language of logistics, but the reality behind the sentence was vivid. An enemy that would not stop, and an army that could not force it to. The quartermaster's reports traveled upward. Some were ignored, some were filed. Some were used as evidence in debates about strategy that the quartermaster could not influence. He was not a commander. He was not a genius. He was a man with a pencil trying to describe a machine. Yet the machine was changing the war. The quartermaster began to think about the difference between German and Allied assumptions. Germany often sought decisive moments, battles that would break the enemy's will or shatter its ability to resist. Germany believed in the sharp blade. The Allies, he realized, believed in pressure. Pressure did not require brilliance every day. It required continuity every day. Pressure was not a single strike. It was a system that made tomorrow inevitable. He thought of the old German obsession with control. In a peacetime, control meant stability. In war, control meant fragility if the enemy could shatter it. Allied logistics did not eliminate chaos. It organized chaos into flow. It accepted imperfection and built recovery into the plan. It treated breakdowns as expected, not exceptional. It built systems that did not collapse when a single part failed. Germany had built a system that assumed discipline could prevent failure. The Allies built a system that assumed failure would occur and designed survival around it. That was the doctrinal inversion. At times, the quartermaster's colleagues would still dismiss the Allied approach as wasteful. "They burn fuel like water," one officer complained. "They destroy roads with weight and tire. They will pay for it." The quartermaster did not deny the waste. He simply asked, when? When would the enemy pay? In a year? After the war? Waste mattered when you were close to your limits. The Allies had built their plan around not being close to their limits. A few weeks later, he received a note from a frontline officer describing a failed German attempt to exploit an Allied overextended flank. German units had moved to strike a perceived weak point, only to find that the enemy's reinforcements arrived faster than expected, supported by artillery that did not run dry. The German officer wrote bitterly, "We hit them, but they did not empty." The quartermaster underlined that phrase too. They did not empty. He knew exactly what it meant. The enemy's supply stream did not run dry at the moment Germany needed it to. As the months progressed, the quartermaster saw how the Allied logistical approach began to influence not only movement but morale. Soldiers who believe they will be fed tomorrow fight differently than soldiers who suspect tomorrow will be hunger. Units that expect ammunition resupply fight with confidence. Units that ration ammunition fight with caution. Confidence is not a moral trait. It is a logistical condition. The quartermaster did not romanticize this. He had seen what shortages did to men. He had seen units become harsher, more desperate, more brittle. He had seen commanders become gamblers, taking risks not because risk was clever, but because risk was the only option left. Meanwhile, the enemy's logistics gave it patience. Patience is lethal when paired with power. The Allies could absorb setbacks because their system could recover. They could plan operations that required sustained supply because their system could deliver. They could accept slower tactical progress in exchange for predictable strategic pressure. Germany's system demanded fast success because it could not sustain long strain. The Allies' system allowed long strain because it could convert industry into endurance. The quartermaster began to see the war as a contest of national habits. Germany had mobilized brilliance and discipline to compensate for limited material. The Allies mobilized material and organization to multiply ordinary competence. Both required sacrifice. Both were brutal in their own ways. But the outcome increasingly favored the side that could turn sacrifice into consistent output. One night the quartermaster traveled along a secondary road to inspect a supply point. He passed through villages half ruined by fighting and retreat. He saw civilians watching German vehicles with blank faces, neither friendly nor hostile, simply exhausted. He saw German trucks parked under trees to avoid air attack, their drivers sleeping on the ground beside them. He saw an improvised repair station with mechanics working by lantern, hands black with grease, faces hollow with fatigue. The German system still functioned, but it functioned like an old machine kept alive by stubbornness. Then he reached a hill and looked down at a main road in the distance. Even at night, the road carried movement, streams of Allied vehicles visible as faint glows of masked lights. The quartermaster felt, for the first time, something close to despair, not at the front's violence, but at the rear's inevitability. Because the road did not look like war, it looked like industry. And industry, once mobilized, was hard to stop. He returned to his quarters and wrote in his notes, not an official report, but a private observation that he would never send. "We have built our war like a blade," he wrote. "They have built theirs like a wheel. A blade must strike perfectly. A wheel only must keep turning." He did not mean this as poetry. He meant it as a warning to himself. Do not expect the enemy to collapse under strain. Expect the enemy to continue. As winter neared, the quartermaster heard more stories about heated depots, about winter gear arriving with unsettling timeliness, about the enemy's ability to keep armor moving, even when roads turned to mud and fields became swamps. He knew winter could still change operations. Winter always did. But winter alone could not replace what Germany lacked, a system that could keep moving even when hurt. This was the cruelest lesson. The quartermaster had always assumed that if you hurt an army enough, it must stop. He had been trained to see pain as limitation, but the enemy had built a system that made pain survivable. A truck destroyed did not stop the flow. A bridge blown did not stop the flow. A depot hit did not stop the flow. It slowed it, diverted it, cost it, but did not stop it. The quartermaster realized that Germany was trying to win by creating decisive moments, while the enemy was winning by preventing decisive moments from mattering. If the enemy could always restore the flow, then no single strike could alter the campaign. That was not a tactical insight. It was a strategic nightmare. When historians later spoke about the war, they would talk about battles and commanders, about bravery and atrocities, about tanks and aircraft and artillery. The quartermaster knew those things mattered. He had never denied the front its importance. But he also knew something else. Every battle was ultimately fed by a rear that either functioned or failed. In 1944, the rear was becoming the front. The quartermaster watched German officers continue to argue about priorities, whether to concentrate fuel for armored counterattacks, whether to conserve ammunition for defensive battles, whether to move units by night to avoid Allied air power. He watched decisions made under scarcity become increasingly desperate. Scarcity forces harsh choices. Harsh choices become habits. Habits become collapse. Meanwhile, the enemy's abundance, when organized properly, became a different kind of harshness. It demanded relentless labor from drivers and mechanics. It demanded administrative discipline from traffic controllers. It demanded risk on roads under threat. It demanded the sacrifice of comfort, sleep, and safety. But it converted that sacrifice into flow, and flow into pressure, and pressure into victory. One afternoon, the quartermaster received a message from a superior officer. His analysis was useful and should be continued. The message ended with a bland instruction to provide further estimates of enemy road capacity and to suggest countermeasures. The quartermaster stared at the paper and felt an anger he rarely allowed himself. Countermeasures, as if this were a technical problem that could be solved with cleverness alone. Cleverness mattered, yes, but cleverness without fuel, without air cover, without reserves, without spare parts, without time, was like a beautiful plan drawn on a paper that would soon be burned. Still, he worked. Work was what quartermasters did when the world refused to be fair. He gathered more data. He spoke to officers who had observed Allied traffic. He read more interrogations. He mapped likely routes and choke points. He proposed raids where possible, mines where feasible, bridge destruction where it might cause delay. He suggested focusing attacks not only on convoys, but on recovery vehicles and repair points, because stopping the flow required stopping the enemy's ability to remove friction. Some of these suggestions were implemented, some were not. The war's tide continued. Months later, the quartermaster stood again at night, listening to engines. He could no longer pretend the sound was temporary. He understood that he was hearing a doctrine in motion, not a doctrine written in manuals, but a doctrine built out of trucks and men, fuel and traffic signs, depots and repair teams. A doctrine that made the enemy's advance less a series of battles and more a sustained process. He thought of the early days when the liaison officer first described the river of trucks and the staff had laughed. The quartermaster wished he could return to that laughter, not because he missed naivety, but because laughter implied options. Laughter implied a world where the enemy's strength could still be dismissed. Now there was no dismissal, only recognition. The recognition carried a moral weight that surprised him. He had spent his life thinking of logistics as neutral. Numbers, schedules, weight limits. Yet numbers became deaths when they failed. A truck that arrived meant artillery could fire. Artillery that fired meant men died. A fuel dump that reached a panzer unit meant a counterattack could occur. A counterattack meant villages burned. Logistics was not moral, but it produced moral consequences. The quartermaster watched a German medical unit evacuate wounded men with too few vehicles, too little fuel, too much distance. He watched nurses improvise and doctors ration supplies. He watched soldiers stand beside the road waiting for transport that did not come. Scarcity was not only a military condition, it was a human punishment. In contrast, the enemy's continuous supply created a different kind of human condition, the ability to keep fighting. That ability prolonged war even as it moved toward victory. It meant battles could continue without pause. It meant pressure could be sustained. It meant the front could keep swallowing men. There was no purity here, only reality. On a cold evening near the end of the year, The quartermaster walked outside and stood alone. The sky was pale with cloud. The road noise in the distance was muted but present. Somewhere men were fighting and dying. Somewhere drivers were gripping steering wheels with numb hands. Somewhere mechanics were tightening bolts under dim light. Somewhere traffic controllers were waving trucks through junctions in the rain. Somewhere fuel was being poured like blood into machines. And somewhere German staff officers were still searching for a decisive strike that could change everything at once. The quartermaster understood, with a kind of quiet bitterness, that the decisive strike had already happened, not in a battle, but in a commitment. The enemy had committed to making the boring parts of war unstoppable. The enemy had committed to turning supply into certainty. Certainty is a weapon. He returned inside and wrote one final private line in his notebook. In the end, he wrote, "We are not losing only because they fight well. We are losing because they can keep fighting tomorrow." He closed the notebook and listened again to the engines, not with disbelief now, but with the weary understanding of a man who has seen a miracle and realized it is made of ordinary things, organized until they become unstoppable. Outside, the road kept humming through the night. The trucks did not stop, and in that continuous movement, the quartermaster heard the sound that every army fears most. Not defeat in a single moment. Inevitability.